Hello interwebs, I hope you're doing well. So for today's video and discussion, I kind of want to structure our conversation and format this week in a little bit of a different way than I normally do. Because if you can make out my horrible chicken scratch handwriting that I have on this board here, today I want to talk about this conversation that we see constantly being brought up with this topic of, are trans women biologically male? I mean, consistently and constantly, we see trans women in news articles and in public discussion being described and talked about as being biologically male.
To compete against two biological males in track and field.
I don't think that biological males should be competing in female sporting events.
I know that there is a very harsh stereotype on the trans community that we are science deniers and that we don't believe in biological sex. I am biologically male. Cue the title. That's just a fact. I am a trans woman. If you are a trans man, you are biologically female. That's kind of the whole point.
And for many people, this seems to be obvious, right? I mean, trans women were born with the, quote, biology of a man and transitioned to be seen as women. I mean, this is how we commonly understand and speak about many trans people, trans women, and all trans folks, with trans masc folks sometimes being referred to as biologically female. Yet I also know some people get confused when trans people push back on being referred to as biologically this or biologically that. I know I do. I don't like being referred to as biologically male. With things getting extremely heated, with people yelling at each other saying, you know, it's just science, or you're ignoring your biology, and that feeds into the overall culture war that we've constantly been in. Not only that, this continual heated discourse in this antagonistic way continually feeds into this stereotype of misinformed view of trans people that somehow trans women, for example, like myself, think that we're the same as cis women, i.e. non-transgender women. Hint, we don't think that, but that is the common narrative around trans people that gets pushed to frame us as somehow ignoring science in some way, ignoring our biology. That when trans women push back on being called biologically male, for example, that we somehow don't understand basic biology that we all learned in middle school. And so, for today's video, I want to turn this conversation off of boil and kind of cool it down and actually have a discussion about why we're seeming to be talking at cross purposes here. Because I think when we have this conversation and when it does get heated, we're actually talking about two completely different things and understandings about how we conceptualize not only biology, sex, and gender, but how we conceptualize all those things both scientifically and socially, and how those two things often come into conflict with each other. But what if I told you that trans people argue, and many people even understand, that sex, that biology, is also socially constructed as well. Now, I know I already hear a bunch of you in the comments balking at that very idea, saying that I'm, again, a trans person who doesn't understand basic science. How could biology, something that's just part of us, be socially constructed? But the point that I want to make with this video is that that basic science idea, that sort of baseline understanding that we think we have of biology, is sometimes so basic in the cultural consciousness and cultural understanding of it that when we start to extrapolate it out not only into larger scientific concepts, but into how we interact in social situations as well, that it fails us miserably, because actual science, actual reality, reflects the much more complex and nuanced view of humanity than we would possibly could learn in a middle school biology class. Yet we in modern culture tend to act as if that basic understanding of biology from middle school is the end-all be-all, and we use that to discuss, interact with, control, and even legislate others' bodies based on this misinformed view of biology and how people are interacting with it. But how it also interacts with intersex issues, and how biology often is wielded as a justification to justify and enact harm and policies against marginalized communities, transgender or not. So before we get started with this video, all right, sorry, we need to pause right here for a second, because if you're a regular viewer on this channel, number one, thank you for coming back, and number two, I bet you're asking, why does this Jessie look so different? I mean, still looks good, but slightly different than the Jessie before you now. That's because this video that you're watching was filmed almost 2 years ago now. I was so young then. Had a much different looking jawline, and I wasn't really a vest person by then, but still was wonderful. But seriously, yes, this was me several years ago before my facial harmonization surgery, which is why I look a little bit different. And I'm releasing this video now because while I filmed it, I, or more specifically my editor Lucian, never really had a chance to edit it until recently. And I still think that the topic of this video is still incredibly pertinent and honestly even more necessary than when I actually recorded it. And also, I am currently in the middle of a ton of work at the moment, both relating to a video that I have coming out very, very soon that is going to be one of the most important videos I think I've ever done. That's going to be a complete dissection and discussion of anti-trans narratives and how they uphold things like racism, anti-Semitism, and more, and how they're interconnected with so many systems within the United States. So yeah, it's a really big video and I've done a ton of interviews with a lot of really cool people for it. And so that's just gonna be taking up a lot of my time for the next few weeks to potentially another month or two before that video comes out. And on top of all of that, because I hate myself, I'm also currently working on getting ready for the production of my science fiction film, Identities, which is finally, after a bunch of other stuff that I won't talk about here, but I did discuss in this video, going into production at the end of October. And most of my cast is queer, trans, and women as well. I am so incredibly proud of everybody. I can't wait for you to see it. We are going into production in just a few short weeks. We are all SAG approved, if anyone was curious or worried about that. So we are not gonna be breaking any strike guidelines, and we fully support the WGA and SAG-AFTRA here. And on top of all of that, we really hope that this production showcases that people can make things outside of these large studio Hollywood systems. You don't need to rely on them, and even more so, by not relying on them, we can center voices that don't often get seen. So I am very pumped, I'm very excited. I think this is going to be an amazing film. And if you want to support it beyond just supporting me through Patreon, please consider going over to Nebula, which is a streaming service that I and several other creators made in order to be able to make content like Identities. Nebula is a place where multiple creators are able to put their videos where they don't have to worry about the dreaded algorithm, and often like to put up exclusive content that you can't get anywhere else. On top of that, Nebula also offers things like Nebula classes where you can learn how to make your own videos and learn how to be a better researcher and things like that with wonderful creators like Tom Nicholson or Foreign Man in a Foreign Land. Or even more so, if you are fans of stuff like Identities, you can check out exclusive content like the series Jetlag, which is a really fun game show that some of my friends made that I really adore watching. Or you can watch The Prince, which is a very trans-focused multiverse science fiction Shakespeare play that was created by the one and only Abigail Thorne, who I absolutely adore and is also part of the cast of Identities. I cannot recommend Nebula enough, and I cannot overstate how much they are helping me produce the best things that I have ever made in my life, and supporting me in making what I want to make, and supporting marginalized creators like myself and others to be able to make really cool content that you can't get anywhere else. So if any of that sounds appealing to you and you want to directly help me, check out the link below where you can sign up for Identities. So please consider checking that out if you wish to support me, Nebula, and Identities, and the numerous other creators on there. Or more directly on Patreon to help me pay my bills, because being frank, the algorithm has not been very kind lately, and it's been a little bit stressful financially the last few weeks in terms of being able to make sure I pay everyone that I work with and being able to pay my own bills. So if you could consider that, it would mean a lot to me, but no pressure. More importantly, I just hope you enjoy the video and share it out if you do like it. That all being said, since the time that this video was made, I feel that I've grown a lot as a creator and learned how to discuss some of these issues that I'm going to bring up in this video more deeply in some of my more recent work. So once or twice during this video, present me, or I guess slightly less past me, is going to come back to just make a few notes and additions to just add a few more avenues that I would have explored further if I made this today. Also, throughout the video, I make a few dated references here and there, such as referring to Tucker Carlson working on Fox News, which thankfully he doesn't anymore, so just be aware of the context of that. And with all of that said, let's get back to younger me and her different yet still very wonderful face. I want to make my hopes for our discussion very clear. While I hope to bring more depth to this topic than our common understanding of this discussion is, I cannot be fully comprehensive, otherwise I'd just be teaching you a college-level biology and gender studies course. Dear heavens, I don't have that kind of time. I've got Star Trek to watch. This video is just meant to be a primer to help people start to poke at that idea, to at least start to have an understanding of how this idea of biologically male trans women is both an oversimplified understanding of the trans community and science, and how that oversimplification gets weaponized against the transgender and other communities. But there will 100% be things that I touch upon that I don't delve into far enough for some people's taste, that I completely miss, or that I even oversimplify in my own quest to add complexity to this conversation. So to paraphrase a certain fictional alien whose own made-up alien biology caused him to have sex only once every 7 years, this video is meant to be the beginning of wisdom, not the end.
I've been doing research on human sex.
And so to that end, this video is going to have 3 parts. First, we'll start with all the stuff that we learned in middle school biology. Just sort of like the basic building blocks of how we think about biology and sex and gender and all that fun stuff, and then we'll add complexity to that idea of biology. From there, in our second part, we're going to talk about how biology is actually constructed in our society, and then finally, we'll end to talk about how that idea of biology being constructed in a society is weaponized specifically against marginalized communities. Why is it that whiteboards can never actually be white? They just leave these traces. It's like a palimpsest of my shitty erasing. I'm not pretentious at all when I say words like fucking palimpsest. Oh, look at me, it's a palimpsest of erasers. Look how smart I am. I know things from the dictionary. So when we talk about this idea of sex and biology, the first thing we usually start with is chromosomes, right? You have XY chromosomes, and you have XX chromosomes. If you have XY chromosomes, you're seen as a boy. And if you have XX chromosomes, you're seen as a girl. Right? That's what we're all taught in our middle school biology class. And then we can talk about how we pass on these chromosomes, but this is the basic idea of that. And so we told that chromosomes basically define everything else we're going to talk about after this. What someone's sex is, what biology they're going to have, what characteristics they're going to have in their bodies, and from there, what their gender is, basically how they're told to interact in society as a girl or a boy. That's our basic understanding of how society is built upon the idea of sex and chromosomes. I need to point out that even at this early stage, there's already a few assumptions being made in the science department. Because, first things first, we say we know someone's biology when we say that they're a boy or a girl when they're born, but before science had even discovered what chromosomes were, we tended to call people a boy or girl. So today, when we say we know someone's chromosomes, that they have these certain chromosomal characteristics, that's not actually what we're saying. So, what are we saying when we say someone is a boy or a girl? Well, what we're actually saying is what genitals they're born with. We tend to say that people born with XY chromosomes are the ones born with penises. And the ones born with XX chromosomes are the ones born with vaginas. Vaginas. God, vagina is a fun word to say. I wish we were allowed to say it more in like everyday discourse without it being like prudish, but it's like vagina. It's just a fun word, just on its own, regardless of context. It's just a fun word. Anyways, and then from there, that's when we say someone is a boy or a girl, right? But it all starts here. And then we assume this, and we go to here. So already we see that there's kind of an assumption made between here and here, and we'll talk a little bit about that in just a little bit. But let's kind of move down again, just with our basic understanding of how this system works, right? Because after we determine that someone has a penis, we tend to think that they're going to have certain biological characteristics, right? That because they're a boy, because they have a penis, and we assume have XY chromosomes, that they're going to have certain physical traits. For example, boys will seem to have a flat chest, or they'll have a deeper voice, or they'll have an Adam's apple. There's many, many more, obviously, but those are some basic ones that we could sort of quick come up with. For girls, what we'll say is they'll have breasts, a higher voice, and maybe softer facial features. Like less sharp angles on their chins. Maybe boys will be taller, girls will be shorter, keeps going from there. But here's another thought that I want to poke at right here. Because these characteristics aren't always one for one, right? Some people born with a penis and seen as boys maybe will have a higher pitched voice, or they'll be really, really short. So this isn't a 100% rule, but we do tend to say that there's a general amount of things that people on this side will fit into. But it's important to note that not everyone will have every single thing that we associate in this category of being under boy or being under girl. But again, just the common understanding here. From there, we would add another layer of what we would kind of call gender. Now, to oversimplify the already complex idea of this idea of gender, let's just talk about gender in this context as the idea of how we interact with each other in society and how we understand our idea of our own sense of self within gender. There's a lot more to it, like marginalization, but just sort of like how we interact with each other. And so these are things that are not physical characteristics, but things that humans have made up. For example, that women are told that they'll like pink, that they'll like dolls, that they can be more emotional, I can spell emotional. Boys are told that they'll like blue, like action figures, and be more stoic. Closed off, less emotional, right? Now, some people tend to argue that there are behaviors that are linked to biology and physical characteristics. Like, for example, people in the physical characteristic pile have more testosterone if they have XY chromosomes, for example. And some people on this side will have more estrogen, which then will lead to like maybe more aggressive behavior or, you know, more ability to express or feel emotions, more access to emotions because of access to estrogen. And that is certainly has some truth in reality. I mean, I started estrogen, and when I started estrogen, I noted a greater ability to access my emotions at certain times. That is definitely true. Now, it's also important to note that some of that may have been a placebo effect, that I may have just been like, oh, I'm taking estrogen, maybe I can feel more emotions, and so I'm just sort of thinking I can feel more emotions when nothing's really changed, other than like my ability to feel like I could express those emotions. So there's a little bit of like chicken or the egg here, but certainly there are some correlation to that idea. But the issue is that we start to say that these things are inherent to these things. That this line going down kind of goes also back up too. That because you have XY chromosomes, which again was an assumption that was made, and because you have a penis, because you're a boy, and because you have all these certain characteristics here, that you are going to be more stoic just inherently. That you should be more stoic. And that's the interesting bit there. Even though men can be emotional. Men can like colors other than blue. Men can like dolls as well. Same thing with girls. Girls are allowed to like action figures and superheroes. They can be more stoic. We've seen very stoic women. I love a ton of them, like Charlize Theron. Girls don't have to like the color pink. But we link all these things to biology. Again, I think most people understand the like minute differences and things going on there, but we tend to say that this generally always has to be the case, and they generally all link back up together. But the other thing that I pointed out earlier that it's very important to notice here is we don't actually know that. All of this, we tend to say comes back to this, and yet we don't actually know it. The thing that we do know, and the thing that all of this is actually determined upon, is genitals, not the chromosomes. So let's explore what that actually means. I think we can start to interrupt all of this. We can start to explode this out into much bigger ways than our basic middle school understanding is. One of the first ways that we can interrupt this table, for example, is with trans people. Trans people just like fucking up the works, don't we? Because we'll come in and make this straight line understanding of biology to genitals to physical characteristics to social interactions and just disrupt the hell out of it. Again, this is an oversimplification, but for example, trans people will say, oh, we know what genitals we have. We know what we were told to be at birth, and we know what physical characteristics we have, and we know what we're told to be in society. Like for me, I was born with a penis, told I was a boy, had flat chest, deeper voice, Adam's apple, the whole nine, and I was told to like blue action figures and be more stoic. All that stuff. We aren't ignorant of any of it. In fact, we're very, very aware of this straight line idea here. Yet we also have this feeling that the way we've been told to exist within all these parameters is off. And that, in some ways, we can mix and match all of these things in different ways. For example, this stuff right here, we can totally change up and mix and match at our very leisure. Like, for example, instead of wearing pants all the time, like I was told to do as a boy, I could, let's add a trans woman up here. And again, this is not all trans women, but this is just for me. We'll use me as an example. I was probably, again, an assumption being made, born with XY chromosomes, but I was born with a penis. I was born seen as a boy. I had all of these things, I'm not gonna write it all down, and I was told to be all these things too, but actually, what if I liked the color pink? I do like the color pink. Blue is actually my favorite color, but still, we'll say I could like the color pink. But what I do like is I do like playing with dolls. I like wearing dresses. I like being more emotional. And what I asked to be seen is be seen as a girl. So there we go. And so those are the things that are easily changeable. These are things that are socially constructed. I could do without anything being changed to my biology in any way, shape, or form. I could easily change this. But we also live in a society today where these things are mutable too. Obviously, I don't have a flat chest anymore. I had surgery. I also took hormones that gave me breasts as well before I even had breast augmentation surgery. So I could have breasts. And my voice, for example, is also deeper than some, but I think it's higher than some people's. Maybe it's a bit affected, but I also think that people that speak deeply also have an affected accent as well. But I still also do have an Adam's apple, but I could also get it removed in a surgery as well, but I still have it. So there we go. And I also had to transition to a neo-vagina because I got a surgery for it. So all of these things for trans people are mutable. And so all of this stuff is what we talk about when we discuss gender as a social construct, that these elements of how we're told to exist in a society are entirely mutable. Someone's born with a penis and can still like wearing dresses. But sometimes this gets frustrating and anger-inducing and even violent or insulting or even oppressive towards trans people is when we're told that we have to be these things, that we have to follow these lines, despite the fact that clearly in our society, we can totally fuck these things up. We can totally change them. Now, there are reasons for why we're told to be that way, and we'll talk about that towards the end of this video, but just for a general discussion here, these things are entirely mutable. It's clear. And also on top of all of that, these things can be mixed and matched. I mean, you could put different types of trans women on here and different things could happen within all of that, and they could have slightly, maybe they don't want breasts, but they still want to have female pronouns, maybe they don't want the Adam's apple, maybe they want to have a deeper voice, maybe they want to use different pronouns. You can put NB people on here and they'll have different things as well. Again, mixing and matching all of these. But these are the things that we're told that we have to be. But here's the thing too, with all of that I just discussed, while trans women point this out and make it very obvious that this is the case, you could do the same in here too with someone who is following this, who is what we would call cisgender, someone who is not trans. Because not every cisgender person born with a penis, seen as a boy, will have, as I said before, will have a deep voice, will like the color blue, will have action figures as their favorite thing, maybe they'll like dolls as well. So these things are exploded as well. These straight lines here are not exactly as straight as we thought them to be. It's just that trans people make it very, very obvious that that is the case. But the thing that we still say that is true, despite all of this, is I have XY chromosomes, right? You know, I can't have a Spider-Man moment and get bitten by a radioactive trans woman and turn into a, radioactive trans girl and have my biology basically changed. It's still XY no matter what I do, no matter how much I change all of these things, it's still that. So that's what we're saying when trans women are biologically male. We are that. Always and forever, right? Because you see, while this basic understanding of biology and chromosomes is helpful, and it's a nice baseline for people, it's actually missing a lot of stuff and kind of makes a lot more presumptions than just the genital bit. Or it also causes us to skip certain steps because we follow this straight down the line sort of idea. Because it's actually a lot more complicated than it would appear. As I said with chromosomes, we tend to think of XX and XY, but actually, as many of us sometimes know, there are people that we would call intersex. And there are many different forms of intersex people that we'll get into in just a sec, but the most common way that we tend to think about that is people born with different types of chromosomes. Like, for example, you can have people born with XXX chromosomes. We can also have people born with XXY chromosomes as well. And then we can have a myriad other ones, but those are the ones we'll sort of talk about here. Now, society tends to think that being intersex is some sort of birth defect because you're not fitting into these norms. And certainly, there can be some medical issues that arise because someone's born with a different set of chromosomes and other intersex conditions that we'll talk about in just a minute. But in a lot of cases, some people are just born with different chromosomes and just live a life normally. And they don't know that they're intersex for quite a long time, if ever. Even if someone has health issues relating to being intersex on a chromosomal level, that's just part of their life and living. There are many people born with XX and XY chromosomes that have their own unique health issues regardless of, which chromosomes they have that also come down to biology, that we don't necessarily say that, they're bad or wrong or awful because of that. It's just sort of like different health for different people and different ways of living and things that they have to cope with and deal with. But sometimes being intersex doesn't negatively affect someone's day-to-day life at all. Or if they do, it's a private conversation with their doctors. But in many cases, intersex people will live what we would consider to be a cisgender existence, never knowing their chromosomes. Like, for example, people with XXX chromosomes will still be born with vaginas. And therefore, they'll be told all this other stuff that we assign to people with XX chromosomes. They're told to like pink, they're told to like Barbies and all that jazz. But One thing that will be different is some of their physical characteristics will be slightly different. Like, they tend to be a bit taller than people born with just XX chromosomes. So already here we're seeing, again, this mixing and matching of biology here. And yet we tend to assume, based on vaginas, that they have XX chromosomes, but they don't. But we say that they do. I had a friend who was born with XX chromosomes, and I had no idea. I didn't know until a very long time into our friendship, and they happened to mention it, and we're like, oh, I was born cisgender. I was born seen as a girl, treated like a girl, liked being seen as a girl, and didn't want to transition at all when I found out that I had XXX chromosomes. It's just a thing that I know about myself. But they only knew that they had XXX chromosomes because they had gotten genetic testing for some reason or another that had nothing to do with them being intersex. So when you say someone has XX or XY chromosomes, that they're biologically something, is that actually true? Do we actually know that? You know, as for me, I am trans. I was born with a penis and seen as male, but I've never been genetically tested. I assume that I have XY chromosomes, but I don't know. I could maybe have XXY chromosomes. I legitimately do not know, and I would venture that you don't know either. This is where it's going to get even more interesting and important, because I know a lot of you are probably looking at that and saying, okay, maybe there are people born with XXX chromosomes, they have vaginas and all that stuff, but what does it really matter? They still have the same biological features, and they still are biologically one thing or another. But there are intersex people who do have XX or XY chromosomes, but due to other factors other than chromosomes, are actually going through a different gender experience due to things like hormones, for example. And for this, I want to talk about a historical example. I want to talk about Maria Jose Martinez Patino. You see, Maria was from Spain, and she was a famous athlete who did hurdles, doing those jumping over the gates, or that thing that people who do hurdles do. She was a Spanish hurdler, and she was seen and competed against other women. But during the time that she started to compete, it became a rule in competitions that those who had competed had to get genetic testing done in order to determine if they could compete. In 1983, Maria participated in the IAAF World Championships, where she passed a test and was given a, quote, certificate of femaleness, which is apparently a thing you can get. Put that up on your wall next to your degree. But a few years later, in 1985, Maria traveled to Japan for the World University Games and forgot to bring her certificate because who carries that around with them all the time? And so there, she got a sex chromatin test, which at the time was only a first step towards sex verification, not a final result or test. Yet she failed the test and was told to fake an injury to step out of competition, which she did. 2 months later, she then found out she had XY chromosomes and thus was disqualified, even though she also learned she had androgen insensitivity syndrome, which is why she had a vagina and secondary sex characteristics often ascribed to women. Despite this, in 1986, she entered the Spanish National Championships, won, and was then vilified by the Spanish press, which placed emphasis on her supposed masculinity. As a result, she lost her athletic residency and was expelled from sports, and all of this even led to the disillusionment of her marriage. Finally, after some scientists came to her defense saying that she didn't in fact have an unfair advantage, she was allowed again to compete in sports in 1988. She then tried to qualify for the Olympics in 1992, but failed to do so, showcasing how, even with XY chromosomes, she did not have a distinct advantage over other women around her. All of this goes to show that Maria was categorized depending on what emphasis people placed upon certain aspects of her biology or her presentation. Maria was cisgender. She was told she was a girl since birth and identified with that, and everyone around her treated her as a girl. And this didn't change because she had XY chromosomes or even after she learned that she had them. She didn't suddenly want to become a dude. Yet, in this specific situation, when people learned she had XY chromosomes, not taking in any other factors or thinking about any other factors, they singled her out for expulsion based solely on this specific characteristic. And so her story emphasizes a few different things, both things I've been discussing and things that we'll be talking about in just a minute. First, it showcases how everything on the chart of biological sex that we showed is interchangeable in some form, either after we're born or just when we're born. Not everything comes together in these two singular buckets. Still, the problem is that society clings to the simple idea of biology in these straight line tracks that must all be associated with each other, and thus it builds its systems upon each other with that assumption of distinct binaries in mind, not allowing for the diversity of humanity. Sports itself segregates between men and women based upon this very idea, despite the whole philosophy of sports being built upon the idea that different people have different bodies that will do better or differently based on a mixture of our biology and how we choose to train our bodies. Not to mention the financial aspects of sports. The way that these ideas, though, become so ingrained in society is what amazing author Terry Pratchett called lies to children, how we oversimplify concepts to create a baseline for understanding greater knowledge. For example, we learn as kids that Earth is a sphere that orbits the sun with other planets around it in straight lines, which helps us to understand bigger ideas like solar systems and galaxies and so on. But in reality, Earth actually isn't a perfect sphere, it's more of a smushed ball. Nor is its orbit perfectly around the sun. It's elliptical, nor is its orbit in exact row with other planets orbiting the sun, as different planets orbit in different axes. But we start with these basic concepts in order to build bigger ideas from there. And we often don't learn more from here because all of these basic understandings work just fine for our everyday lives. Yet they become ingrained because they aren't developed or questioned further because not everyone goes on to study these concepts in greater detail. And the same happens when we discuss biology in everyday society. We typically don't need to know more about biology beyond the basics. Yet the problem becomes when we start to legislate or discuss or dictate things around biology within these limited terms as if they are all-encompassing or the way the world works in totality or completely. When trans people are talking about biology, we're actually trying to point to that yes, we have this basic understanding, but it's much stranger and more complex, something that the very existence of trans and intersex people points out. So when people say, are you biologically male? The question should become, what does that mean? What emphasis are you placing on what? Which is something we're going to get to in just a moment. And so interestingly, as we exploded out that chart that I had on this board earlier, the existence of trans people and intersex people call all this common understanding of sex and gender into question. Because what we would see if we put all these people on a graph is this sort of idea. That there are a lot of people that kind of line up with this idea of XY, that straight line idea that we were talking before, and that idea of XY that a lot of people do line up. But that's just right here. That's just right here. Those are the people that fit into this. So yes, that amount of people do. What about all the people here? What about the people here at the fringes? What about all the people here and those people at the fringes? When people see this type of graph, which we would call a bimodal graph, people tend to think like, oh, these big humps are everybody that fits into that. It's like, no. Only that. Only this segment. All the rest of people don't fit into those camps. And then on top of that, this is just chromosomes. What about that hormone stuff that I talked about before? You can make a whole new chart over here for hormones. That is that exact same thing. You make a whole new chart over here for people whose gender identity doesn't match up over here. And then you try to map these things onto each other and mix and match them on top of each other. And you'll see that so few people will line up in the middle here, in the middle here, in the middle here, in the middle here, and in the middle here. No, there are very few people that on all of these different charts, we can even add more charts on top of that, fit into these segments on each one of these charts. Almost no one does. It's very messy. Society tries to put people into these simple paths, and yet it's much more complicated than that. For example, we could have someone who has XX chromosomes and falls into that line just straight down the middle, exactly XX chromosomes exactly that we wish to see, but maybe they have a hormonal imbalance. Or maybe their hormonal imbalance is exactly the same, and maybe they are transgender and so fall in a different gender expression despite being the same hormones that we tend to see as typical, or XX chromosome that we tend to see as typical. It's all different. It all lines up in different ways. Hey, future Jessie again. So I want to just take a quick moment to point out further how biological traits are in fact mutable. And I think the best way to do that is to point out me standing here before you next to my past self. As I said before, I've had facial harmonization surgery, sometimes known as facial feminization surgery, and my literal facial structure and bones are clearly different than the past me through surgical means. And I did a whole video after that surgery that I recommend you check out here because it is one of my most vulnerable and emotional. But even beyond surgeries, of which I've had several, including, breast ones that make it kind of hard to fit into vests. Still a vest person though, but I've also had hormones that also do change someone's sex characteristics as well. And this is not me changing my gender regarding how I express myself socially or relate to my own personal sense of identity, but me altering my biological traits, my biological sex characteristics. But the reason these changes to the body are so vilified in our society today is essentially a call for naturalism. That our bodies as humans, as they came out of the womb, are the best and only way that we should exist. These calls to naturalism arguments are usually used to buttress up other things that we'll talk about later on in this video, but in actuality, we augment and change our bodies constantly throughout all of our lives, whether it be through glasses, medical procedures, etc., not just relating to gender. But because our society so genders people, and it is core to how we essentialize folks and try to assign people and define people, that when we do change our genders, it is seen as more unnatural and vilified, when really, my body and my bones are still just as natural as ever. And we'll talk a little bit more about the why of all of that in a little bit, but I wanted to highlight this lovely visual dichotomy I have with my past self to make this point. Anyways, back to me! And they say trans people are narcissists. And even further, on top of that, as I kind of point out with this, intersex folks are way more common than we would think. And because that's humanity. We're all different in subtle ways due to our biology, our gender, our way we interact in society, what societies that we're born in. Yet we tend to shove all these folks into cisgender lifestyles, asking them to conform to some ideal version of a man or woman. And they never really can be that because none of us can ever be that one singular thing. And we don't allow for any variations outside of those singular ideas of man or woman, even though people who we would think to be man or women wouldn't fit in that either. None of us fit into that lane. As well, none of us should. But that is just the science. Because I've kind of tended to ignore a few times when we extrapolate this out into society and how we use this basic understanding of biology and science in order to interact and qualify and force others into those boxes that I've been talking about. All of that can be applied to how we think socially about gender and sex in our society. And now time to erase the board again. We're erasing the board again. I like to erase the board. This is the song I sing. I'm kind of embarrassing, but I'm doing it. I just realized the camera is rolling, and that's just fine, cause Lucian won't make this part of the edit, cause he's a good person. I'm not guilting him to make him feel bad about putting this in here. I'm a good person. Please don't hate me, Lucian. I love you. Don't put my singing into the video, cause it would be embarrassing. You see, because society wishes to fit people into those boxes, but we don't actually perfectly fit neatly into those boxes, what happens is that when we assign or think about people's sex or gender, we tend to place different emphases on different aspects of people at different times in order to fit them into those boxes. And the best way to discuss how we humans do that is through what we call cluster properties. Cluster properties are very complicated, but for our purposes today, we'll talk about cluster properties as a way to describe concepts by grouping different properties around them that tend to be associated with them. Hey, I'm jumping in here from the future. So when I filmed this section, let's just say that the example that I'm about to use to illustrate my next point was a little less contentious as it is today. Sadly, I'm stuck with it in the edit, but yeah, this example is not one that I would use today. So just fair warning on that. But ultimately, I still think this example is helpful to explain this issue. Anyways, let's get on with it. Yay. In order to explain this, let me use something that I think a lot of people in our culture today would sort of understand. A very nerdy concept, and one that you probably wouldn't think that a trans person would use given that there's a certain author behind this concept, but I think it will help illuminate and illustrate this conversation well. So I think the best way to talk about this is through something like Hogwarts houses. So, for example, we have Gryffindor, right? Gryffindor is a Hogwarts house. We tend to say that they're brave, right? Or that they're strong. That they're determined. Maybe we'd even say something like they're athletic, right? And so these are all properties that we tend to say orbit Gryffindor. And we also have other houses too as well, like we have Ravenclaw. But the thing is, with these cluster properties, does every single person need to fit into these exact rules to be one? Like, for example, Harry Potter, we would definitely say, who was a Gryffindor, we would definitely say he was determined, athletic, strong, and brave, correct? But for Neville Longbottom, he wasn't particularly athletic until you get into later movies, because hot damn, Neville Longbottom, like... We would say Neville Longbottom was brave, certainly. We wouldn't say he was particularly strong. Athletic, maybe. Determined, definitely. So Neville Longbottom doesn't have all these qualities, but he's definitely a Gryffindor, which is why we say it's a cluster property. That you don't need all of these different properties in order to fit into the definition here. The same thing for Ravenclaw. Not every Ravenclaw needs to be a bookworm or nerdy, but maybe they're wise, maybe they're clever, right? So this idea of cluster properties helps us sort of see this idea of like, you don't need every single thing to be considered an idea here. But here's the interesting thing that we can blow this out with. Because what determines whether you get to be a Gryffindor or a Ravenclaw? Because let's look at someone like Hermione, for example. Hermione is someone that we would say is nerdy, is clever, is a bookworm, is wise. So why isn't Hermione a Ravenclaw? She has every single one of those properties. Well, the other thing that Hermione has is that she's determined and she's also brave, right? But again, why isn't she grouped into Ravenclaw? Because she was actually a Gryffindor. The reason being was that she herself placed more emphasis on being brave than any of these other things. And that's what put her into Gryffindor. Even in the Harry Potter books, this is expressly stated because, you know, we also had Harry Potter, who almost at one point was almost assigned to Slytherin.
You could be great, you know. It's all here in your head. And Slytherin will help you on the way to greatness. There's no doubt about that. No? Well, if you're sure, better be Gryffindor!
But you see, in that scene, Harry didn't place emphasis on the qualities of himself that fit Slytherin. He chose to associate himself more with brave, to be Gryffindor. He could have been assigned Slytherin at birth, but he wasn't. He placed more emphasis on one thing over the other, despite the fact that he had all these other different things that would have fit him into Slytherin, those cluster properties. While the result of both Harry and Hermione ending up in Gryffindor was the same, we see that for Hermione, society, someone external to herself, assigned her a Gryffindor, and for Harry, he himself assigned that. Isn't it interesting when we think about these same concepts in terms of gender? What do I mean by that? Well, let's just say we have boys and we have girls, right? Those are the two big genders that we see assigned in our world today. Again, there are more, but we'll just, again, oversimplify here. What are things that we would say for girls? We would say girls tend to have breasts, tend to have XX chromosomes, tend to have ovaries, they tend to have more estrogen, I guess I spelled it there. I meant estrogen, but whatever, we'll add an A. They also tend to have vaginas. These are things that orbit being a girl. Men, conversely, will say have flat chest, have penises, have testicles, which is another fun word to say. We'll have testosterone. We'll like action figures. We'll put over here for girls, we'll say they also have dolls. These are things that all orbit each other. And so this is how, in a cluster property, we can sort of make sense of what we were talking about before, about how we group certain things around certain people. That we will assign girls if they have a predominance of these traits, even if they don't have every single one at a certain moment. You know, not every woman will have ovaries, for example, or estrogen, or like dolls, but they will have vagina, breast, or preponderance of these things that assign them into being a girl. Same thing with being a man. They don't have to have all these things. Maybe not every man will like an action figure, but they'll tend to have a general conflation of these properties. But trans people, in many ways, do that thing that we said, you know, for me, I was born with a flat chest, that I was born with the testicles, I even had a penis, but I also liked dolls, for example, or I liked wearing, you know, let's put on things like here, like I liked wearing dresses, I liked using she, her pronouns, things like that. So I had all of these things, and that's how I determined I was a girl, because I put greater emphasis on these aspects of myself. There are much more than dresses and she, her, and all that stuff, but I place greater aspects on those things. And now today I have she, her pronouns, wear dresses, don't have testicles or a penis or any of those things, but I do still have an Adam's apple. I do also probably have XY chromosomes, right? Again, we're assuming, but let's just go for the sake of it that we do. So for me, this is what I place myself in. I also have, you know, greater preponderance of estrogen now that I've, you know, started taking hormones and things like that. So this would be me. I, you know, place greater emphasis on certain things for myself, and that is what put me into the girl cluster property for myself and for many others who thankfully see me and appreciate the way that I see myself. So how we emphasize certain characteristics and choose to emphasize certain characteristics determines into what larger property that we orbit around. Because I place less emphasis on my chromosomes. I don't care what chromosomes have. I at least place less emphasis on the fact that I have an Adam's apple. I don't really care. I place greater emphasis on all these other things and how my comfort level is in all these things to be seen as a girl. This brings us to a different aspect of the discussion because we don't just use these cluster properties for ourselves. We don't get to be the only one that use them for ourselves. But what's problematic and what gets hard is when external forces and people see a different type of cluster property or place different emphases on different things within your cluster properties in order to group you into different groups, and why they group you into different groups. You see, for this final part, I hope that all of this of what I've explained here before will help explain how trans people, as well as intersex people, because intersex people could also be tossed into this cluster property board as well, will show you how much we construct socially the idea of sex. How, yes, biology definitely is a thing, but there's much more complexity to that, and then how we think about it in society, how we place different emphases on different things within biology, within that targeting things, can actually socially construct the idea of sex as well as gender. But this still didn't answer the question that I raised at the beginning of the video. Why do trans people get so upset when people start to talk about our biology? When they say things like we have certain chromosomes. And it's not just the fact that we don't know what our biology is, because there's a little bit more to it. Let's start by looking back at that story of Maria that I mentioned earlier on in the video. She had a labia, breasts, ovaries, vaginas, estrogens, the whole 9 yards, was seen as a girl from birth, had all of that stuff, and yet she also had XY chromosomes. She didn't have every piece of this cluster property, yet she was placed into the role of girl because she placed greater emphasis on all those other things and not her chromosomes. In her life, she went through her entire life, her entire sports career up until 1985, being considered a girl because that's what she placed greater emphasis on, even though she didn't have XX chromosomes like she thought she had. She went about her daily life in things like sports, interacting with people as a woman, because that's how she and everyone else saw her. But that changed in Japan in 1985. Nothing about her changed. She had the same cluster properties as before, but the people who worked at that sports competition, when they tested her, they found that she had XY chromosomes. And because they placed greater emphasis on the fact that she had XY chromosomes, she didn't have the Adam's apple, but because they placed greater emphasis on her having XY chromosomes, she was not allowed to compete. She herself would not have placed greater emphasis on XY chromosomes than anyone else, but because they didn't group her into being seen as a girl, they grouped her into being seen as a boy. And therefore, allowed her to not compete. None of her cluster properties changed at all. The only thing that changed was which property they placed more emphasis on, and thereby which group they placed her in based on how much emphasis that they put on that property. While she would have placed so much more emphasis on all of these things, they just saw that and therefore grouped her differently. Emphasis, what we choose to emphasize, can make all the difference in terms of what group that we're assigned to. But there's also a conflict between how we would emphasize certain qualities of ourselves and how society or different groups within society would group you and place different emphasis on different things. And that is partially why there's this heated, contested problem when we talk about biology for trans women. Because we see, as Maria's case starts to indicate, people can be ostracized and be discriminated against, or at least pushed out of certain spaces because people place certain emphasis on different things in different contexts. You see, the reason that trans women specifically, and trans men as well, but we'll talk about trans women just to keep it simple here, tend to notice that the people who bring up our biology the most tend to be the ones that are placing greater emphasis on things like we have XY chromosomes, which again, by the way, we don't even know, but they place greater emphasis on that more than anything else. You know, as I said before, this would be me. I have all of these properties just like Maria did, but I would group myself into a girl just like she did. And yet some people, because of my biology, again, we don't even know, would say because I have XY chromosomes, because I was born with a penis, even though I don't have that anymore, they place greater emphasis on born with a penis versus having a penis. So I have born with a penis, even though I now currently have what you would say like a neo-vagina. They would say that I'm a boy. But here's the last piece of this puzzle that I wish to ask you. Why are people placing greater emphasis on one thing over another? That is the real question. You see, I'm not saying that my chromosomes are completely irrelevant. Like when I go to my doctor, I want him to know what my chromosomes are, and I want him to place a greater emphasis on my certain aspects of my biology that maybe don't line up with me fitting into this cluster property. I'm not ignoring that. I'm not saying that when we talk about things in sports that there isn't a need to emphasize certain aspects of things, like maybe what testosterone levels have, or maybe we split people up by body size or muscle and place greater emphasis on different things. But the issue I have is like when I'm talking to someone like my next door neighbor in society, why is my biology relevant? Why would you place greater emphasis on me having XY chromosomes to determine whether you see me as a boy or not? You see, whenever the term biological male gets brought up in modern discourse in the news and things like that, it's not done by doctors. Whenever that phrase comes up, it's usually in the context of talking about trans rights and trans issues, where people emphasize us, trans women specifically. Again, trans men are different than this, but for trans women, they place greater emphasis on us having XY chromosomes. For example, look at all those news reports that I showed you at the top of this video.
Well, for decades, America has been a world leader in providing athletic opportunities to women and girls on the same footing as boys. But now opportunities for women are being shoved aside for a new priority: transgender athletes. Biological males who identify as females are entering the competition and dominating their opponents in many sports.
All of those clips were people bringing up a trans woman's biological male status in segments to discuss how trans rights have gone too far. Let me give you a specific example of what I'm talking about here. Do my chromosomes matter when it comes to which bathroom I use? Not at all. None of us are getting genetically tested at the door. So why would I place emphasis on my chromosomes on whether I use the men's bathroom or the women's bathroom? I'll just use the women's bathroom. Yet there are groups out there and legislation being passed that say biological males shouldn't use the bathroom. They argue that we should place greater emphasis on someone's chromosomes or the fact that they have a penis, for example. In fact, they're not even talking about whether or not someone has a penis or not. And they're not even talking about chromosomes or not, because we don't know what chromosomes have. And for me, for example, I have a vagina right now. And yet these legislations would still force me to not use the women's bathroom, even though I have a vagina. You see, the emphasis they're focusing on, the thing that they are placing the most emphasis on, is that we're trans. That's the issue. That's the danger. You see, the issue that trans people have with groups calling us biological males is not that we can test our biology. Most of us are very well aware of what aspects of our biology, physical, or social characteristics align or don't align with how we're told to be based on our genitals that we're born with. No, the issue we take is that often when people say biological males, is that they're not focusing on our biology at all. They're focusing and placing emphasis on our transness, and our transness is the determining factor of whether they see us as boys or girls, and discriminate against us accordingly. For example, TERFs, sometimes known as gender-critical feminists, having emphasis on the quotes with the word feminist there in the United States and UK, are a dogmatic anti-trans hate group who will argue that biological males, quote-unquote, should stay out of women's bathrooms. And they say that they do that because they're solely focused on biology, solely focused on if you have a penis or not. But then you'll see prominent TERFs say that cisgender men should come into the bathroom to protect cisgender women.
And men, for once, I'm talking to you. I'm talking about you dads who maybe carry, I think that's what you say. I'm so down with the American lingo. Maybe you consider yourself a protector of women. Maybe you're that sort of man. I think you should start using women's toilets, men, because you have every right to self-identify. Clearly don't do it and upset women and girls that are already in there, but just make a point of doing it and maybe make the women feel okay about you doing it if you come out and you frighten someone. But it's about time that you started using women's toilets and saying that you identify as a woman if stopped. And I think that's how you're going to that's one of the many ways that you are going to have to combat the insanity of self-ID. Even if it's not called self-ID, that's pretty much what you have now in the United States. And that's how you men are going to help.
So what many TERFs are saying with their mouths is that they're talking about biology, but they're clearly not, because they'll let cisgender men into the women's bathroom to protect women. So the real thing that they're placing emphasis on, the real discriminating factor, emphasis on the word discriminating, is that we're trans. It's the same in sports. You'll see people like Tucker Carlson argue that biological males shouldn't compete in women's sports. But as I said earlier, there are numerous different factors that we could use to determine whether someone should be grouped into different sports, like their muscle mass, their height, their amount of testosterone levels, things like that, that are probably better to use than simply if someone's got a penis or a vagina. Hell, there are cisgender women who would beat cisgender men in many things. So I think there are better ways to determine how we just split up sports and emphasize different traits in sports other than sex. But with Tucker Carlson and other right-wing groups trying to legislate women's sports, actually legislate women's sports that we've seen in places like Florida and Texas, the only issue they actually care about is not someone's chromosomes or even what genitals they have. The thing that they care about most is that someone is trans. Talking about being biologically male is the way that they obfuscate that, but if you look at their actual actions, that idea of a biological male is just a dog whistle to hide their transphobia. Tucker Carlson, for example, would like to be thought of, I'm sure, as a big bad biological male. But what if we genetically tested Mr. Carlson and found that he actually had XX chromosomes and had just a hormonal imbalance like Maria, for example? I doubt that Mr. Carlson would certainly be arguing that he should be referred to as a woman, even though he would be considered biologically female by his own standards that he stated in his own videos. The reason that he would want that is because he knows that in society, when we talk about who has power, the greater emphasis that we place on someone is that they are a man. And so he'd want to consider emphasizing that he is a man. Hey, jumping in here. The other thing to notice with how these issues are framed and the emphasis being placed upon it is how it's used to frame someone's choice and control. The use of the phrase biological male is often used to deny one's ability to choose to define ourselves for ourselves. Thus, it all becomes about the question of bodily autonomy and the use of an oversimplified view of biology, be it against trans people, black people, women's bodies generally, or other marginalized people, is used in an attempt to define them in a way someone else understands or wishes us to be seen as functions for, and thus control us through. So all of this rhetoric and this emphasis placed on whether you are trans or whether you are black or something like that as a way to deny someone access to womanhood and gender is a way to deny bodily autonomy and thus control someone by emphasizing how they wish to define us and trying to continue to put us into simple boxes, going back to the oversimplification of our world I spoke about earlier. With people in power treating all of us as children to make us think that the world is much simpler than the complex universe that we actually live within in order to control our actions. Anyways, now that you've seen a little bit of anarchist Jessie, I'm gonna step out this way. And this is the important thing too, because I'm talking about all this idea in the context of trans people, but it happens to intersex people too. We try to conform intersex people into certain aspects of their biology to fit into these certain properties. Some intersex people are born with indeterminate genitals and not really clearly vaginas or penises, and so we will force surgeries onto intersex people to make them have one type of genitals or the other to make them fit into our idea. And that's a way to discriminate against someone using biology that they need to fit into these ideas in order to be seen as full human beings. Even further, biology has always been used as a factor to justify and obfuscate someone's bigotry. Take for example, pseudosciences like phenology or eugenics, which said that black people had different sized skulls and were therefore inferior biologically. Remember when DiCaprio talked about that in that Tarantino movie? That was a real thing that people used to justify bigotry against black people, even though really, if you looked at people's actions, this idea of biology really didn't fit, because biology is much more complicated and people are using it just as justification to hide their discrimination. Hello again. So I want to touch even further upon this racial component here, as back when I made this video 2 years ago, I wasn't as good at talking about these issues. Hell, I'm still learning how to discuss race, as well we all should be learning. But to focus in, I've discussed a lot of the issues that I'm gonna mention here in further detail in my videos on TERFs and AI, as well as my one on civility politics. And I also recommend this lovely video by Lily Alexander or this lovely video by Foreign Man in a Foreign Land to go into further detail as well. But I think I would be missing a piece of the discussion here if I didn't at least mention these issues in this video, as it's a crucial context to understanding why we essentialize people this way through gender and biology, and why we tell people that biology is core to who we are. Part of the reason that we have such fixed views of womanhood today in Western culture stems directly from the efforts of colonialization. After many cultures were colonized by European countries, the rigid gender binary that European countries had started to build up as viewing women as property for men, as well as women staying in the home and men being able to go and work outside of the home, was then often enforced upon these colonialized cultures in order to force them to conform to Western culture's views of gender. This is not just done to make them fit into a European mold, but done specifically to dehumanize the people that these European countries were colonizing, because they wished to frame their new subjects as less human beasts whose gender did not match up with those of real humans, i.e. European standards. On top of that, they would enforce what the idea of a man and woman were supposed to be. For example, Foreign Man in Foreign Land discusses in his video how many black women often had more voluptuous bodies. And as a result, Europeans tried to frame voluptuousness as inhuman, despite the fact that Europeans at the time actually viewed voluptuousness as a sign of wealth. Going further, for many indigenous women in the United States, European cultures imposed ideas that women's subordination was essential to a gender dichotomy, despite the fact that many indigenous tribes even had matriarchal cultures, or what some anthropologists framed as low-intensity patriarchies that allowed participation of women within these cultures. But when attempting to colonize these societies, Europeans framed indigenous women as hypersexual and sinful compared to the purity and weakness of European colonial women, thereby to conceptualize indigenous women as lesser beings than real women, i.e. European women, and thus able to be enslaved for labor and dehumanized. Thus, through all of these efforts, white womanhood was framed in opposition to racialized womanhood, specifically indigenous and black womanhood. As a result, white women were also framed as weaker than men, needing protection from racialized people and other white men who did not, in the eyes of their husbands, own them, seeing women as property, and more. This is why you often see trans women framed as big, scary, aggressive men who can beat women, quite often within discussion around sports. It's why these conversations around biological males that trans women supposedly are often stem from or start in conversations around sports, where you so very normalize the view of men and women as distinctly different and women needing separate sports because they are supposedly weaker than men. But in actuality, the way we set up sports, right down to literal sports spaces, their institutions, and even the rules, are all used to service traits that we assign to masculine white bodies and disadvantage white women's bodies, thus making it appear that women are weaker than men when in actuality is generated by these systems and spaces that we created. This is not just the case in sports, but in the entire Western world, but sports is where we have most rigidly gendered things and most created an artificial system in which to create versions of hierarchy. All of this is why you'll often see black and indigenous women as well cut out of sports based on a biological reasoning, regardless of whether they are cisgender or trans. The definition of womanhood is based on the white ideal stemming from colonialization. Take Christine Mboma and Patrice Massalingi, who are two black cisgender women who were not allowed at the Olympics because of their testosterone levels, despite them not being trans at all. Thus, we can see how biology is used to discriminate against gender and races based on pseudoscientific justifications of delineations between sex, race, and gender, and more. Obviously, there's so much more to discuss here, but I think I needed to discuss this context within this video as it's really, really important to it. But I highly recommend you check out those videos that I recommended for more. But back to past me. And so I, personally, am always wary of people using biology in order to justify legislation and controlling people's bodies and how we're able to exist socially in spaces. Especially considering that biology has only really been explored a little bit throughout all of human history, and we're still working to understand how its complexities work. And that we shouldn't base our entire society on the simplified version of something that we learned in high school that doesn't give us the full picture. And so as we wrap this video out, I just want to say a few things that I want to just emphasize and reinforce as takeaways from this video. I would ask you, if you do think that someone's biology is so incredibly important, I would ask you why you find it so important. In what context do you consider certain aspects of biology to be really important? I would ask you to challenge yourself to question whether or not you're actually thinking about someone's chromosomes, if that's what you're talking about, or if you're thinking about actually something else, and what you're actually placing emphasis on, and for what reasons, and what the ramifications of that are. I'm not judging you if you do say that trans women are biologically male. What I'm asking you is to just question what that means and what you're thinking about when you're saying that. This isn't a judgment. It's meant to instigate a conversation, not only between us, but within you as well. At what point do you point out when someone's trans versus when you don't point out that they're trans, for example? And in what context are you doing that? I think there is a larger conversation to be had, but it needs to be an open and honest one. One that we're true to ourselves and honest with ourselves and with others. Because when we don't have that open and honest conversation, people can take those assumptions, those lack of challenging ourselves and our ways of thinking about the world, that people will take advantage of them in order to gain power by leveraging bigotry and taking advantage of our simplified idea of how society should structure itself. And so, if you look at this board, and Lucian, my editor, will hopefully put these up in much better, not chicken scratch ways in front of me as I say them, but these are the main takeaways that I want you to have from this video. Number 1, no trans person is ignorant of biology. Number 2, biology is much more complicated than we're taught. Number 3, despite this, society still tends to use simplified science in order to group people. Number 4, we tend to determine groups by what we emphasize. Number 5, different groups, cultures, and people will place different emphasis on different things at different times. And number 6, it's important to ask why and how someone is grouping someone and what they're actually placing emphasis on, especially when we talk about biology, because it can be used to mask discrimination and bigotry. And so all of that are the important things that I want you to take away from this video. It's always important to ask why and for what purpose someone is using biology as the strongest determining value of someone, because often it's rather irrelevant and it's being used to hide other more discriminatory factors, given that biology is actually much more complicated than we typically allow for. Alrighty everybody, thank you so much for watching this video. Like I said, it was filmed a little while ago, so I hope you understand that I've grown as a creator, so there's some things I would probably do a little bit better if I was filming this today. Or maybe do it worse if you think of become a worse creator, but I think I've generally grown. And so I hope that this video is helpful, and I hope you learned a lot from it. It was even helpful for me to go over it for the video that I'm going to be working on coming in hopefully a few weeks, but probably a little bit longer than that, just considering the sheer size of it. Speaking of which though, I really hope that you will consider subscribing to this channel, because I do have a lot of really big videos coming on the horizon that I am very excited about. The next 2 videos on this channel are going to be really big research projects. One is going to be a very nerdy thing, but I also think a very politically salient video that's going to be discussing the politics of Star Wars and why they are very incoherent. And I think it'll be really fun. We're doing animation for it. A shout out to Aaron for doing so much work on that. So please stick around for that video. But beyond that, a much darker video that I'm currently working on writing at the moment is a big dissection of gender critical and anti-trans narratives, and really discussing how they all ultimately lead up to fascism and other bigotries within the United States. So please wait for that video. I am excited is the wrong word, but I think it's a really necessary one. But both of those videos are really big projects, so please consider subscribing, and please consider supporting me over on Patreon if you can, because like I said, the algorithm has not been kind, and bills have been difficult a little bit lately, so if you can consider supporting me over there during this time when I'm going to be working on bigger projects, it does mean a lot. And you get yourself cool perks like your name in videos, or in preparation for that larger video about anti-trans narratives, I've been doing interviews with some really cool creators about different topics that intersects with anti-trans stuff. Such as this wonderful interview I did with the amazing Zoe B about the right-wing war on public education, and how the right wing is using culture war narratives around transgender people to attack public education.
When something like education becomes focused on efficiency, becomes focused on generating a profit, you stop caring about the actual thing, which is education and the human beings that you're teaching. And that's what you see a lot of the time with these schools, like these online schools, like the Exodus Institute. They're very bad.
And that interview and more are over on my Patreon that will drill down deeper into these discussions, whereas my larger video will be more about how these different systems intersect with each other. And I should say, due to the amount of projects that I'm going to be doing, and also to preserve my mental health, it's going to be a little bit longer between videos. So again, Patreon really does help me to remain sustainable during those times. But even if you can't do that, I hope you are also excited for the stuff that I'm going to be making, including Identities, which, as I mentioned before, is a sci-fi film that is honestly a dream project of mine. I'm working with so many cool people. But beyond all of that, thank you so much for sticking through this. I hope you are taking care of yourselves. The world seems dark right now, but we always have each other, and that is the hope that will lead us to a better future. And beyond all of that, I hope you all, my friends, live long and prosper. Thank you so much for watching this video, but an extra special thank you to all my patrons who make this video possible and make it possible for me to be able to pay my bills and also help pay my collaborators fairly. I could not do this without all of you, so thank you. And an extra special thank you, as always, to Carrie, Ellen, Foss, Joe, Herman, Hold, Niels, Eliasburn, Olsen, Home, Arc 10, Arc, Leos, Silly, Gray, Omi, Eos, Heather, Ratlong, Barbie Ann Round, Sarah Montgomery, Jack McCallan, Stephen Clenord, Hannah Fendrick, Christian Hirsch Jemshin, Michael Wolnitz, Kristen Ray Kelly, Alex Miller, Chloe Dollar, Randy Thompson, Barbara Rusky, Auntie Kate, 808, Samuel Howard, Dark Archon, Matt Chung, Naisa Mary, Christine S., Brits Krieg, Super Desi, Spooky Heather Sylvia, Alicia Stice, Lily Blaney, Tara Rose, Stephen Coyle, Angela Hendricks, Meadow Whisper, Jolene Gilly, Joseph Dewey, Marshall Nye, James Krivda, Rose Conley, Zane Schussler, Dominic Noble, William Tony, Vincent Ellington, Jennifer Fuss, Weirdy Beardy, Kaylee Lang, Ruth, Sunk Corgi, Sean McKenzie, Nathaniel Fraughton, Jolene Cassidy, Sonia Nero Perdeau, Ferengito, Transit Toronto Quattro, Lev Goodwin, Sasha M, Ryan Hunter, Teresa, Ryan Corkin, Leather Boyd, Scott Russell, Craig and David, W. Randy Edie, Shield Maiden 4444, Carry On, Damian Rice, John Weatherby, Teague Wilson, Kalara Arula, Stephen Richardson, LK, The Mighty Jin Dojo, Jade Persuades, Drew Bach, Kevin Froteg, Melinda Walters, Sean Sullivan, Liza, Sean Piper, Matthew Craiglow, Beatrix Purvis, Jennifer Fronister Flynn, Mark H. Williams, author, Flynn N. Kanda, Devin Camelocker, Melody Ann, Winter's Good, Epsilon is Greater Than, Adam Smasher, Casual Observer, Sarah Bystem, Sarah Leslie Hutchkins, Patricia Crompt, Roy Negby, William Stewart, Jeffrey D. Thomas, Becky Sparks, Verdict Sky, Sarah Lemero, Katie K., Bob's Agate, Emma Ramirez, Sky Skinner, Jess Johnson, Blueberry Hill, Joe Comics, Jason Knott, Kirk Mullen, Alex Vincent, Laura Demereau, Joe Blue, Joanne the Wretch Witch, Zamula Kincaid, Zordy Lucero, Troy Stull, Valeria Blackbird, Luna, Rosalind Bennett, Celestial Dawn, The Tipsy Changeling, Grumpy Dragon 75, Tori Puritz, Hope, Jason Tuliana, Zophiel, Nikki Gordon Bloomfield, Crit Fax, Carolyn Clark, Clingy, Callum McLeod of the Clan McLeod, Michael Weber, Adam Ardiel Taylor, It's a Bug, Not a Feature, and Abigail Marie. Mwah! Love you all.